Okay, good evening, everybody. So we are in chapter 11 of the text of Vedanta Treatise, the Eternitites. Chapter 11 is entitled The States of Consciousness, and we're in the section entitled The Fourth State. Anyone have any questions on anything before we pick up with the text? Okay, so let's just do a brief sort of recap of what we've already been covering in this chapter. So what this philosophy is essentially doing is introducing yourself to yourself. It's giving us the information of who or what we are, what our identity is. And so it does this in various ways. It approaches this problem from different perspectives. So you may recall from earlier on when we were discussing the text, he describes the individual as a composite actor, perceiver, feeler, thinker, contemplator. This is how he can describe the individual, one of the ways we can talk about what we are. So we have an active personality. I am the doer of these things. We have an emotional personality. I am the feeler of these feelings. We have an intellectual personality, which is our ideology and our cultural values. We have a spiritual personality or religious personality maybe. We've got all of these different ways of defining and describing who we are as an individual. So one of the things he touches on in this particular chapter is to say that the philosophy of the West is primarily drawn from the waking state of consciousness in terms of trying to figure out, who am I? He says you're working with incomplete data if you do that. So he redefines the individual as the combined waker, dreamer, deep sleeper. So for, let's say, from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m., you are in the waking state of consciousness. You are a waker. That's the subject that interacts with the world to give rise to your experiences. And let's say the waker is an athlete, very physically fit and so forth. You go to bed, you go into the dream state where you occupy a different identity. You may be a cripple in the dream. It's an entirely different identity that you're claiming. And then when you go into the deep sleep state, there is another identity of nothingness. And so when we look at these three different states, these three different personalities, now we can redefine the individual as the combined waker, dreamer, deep sleeper. So the question then arises as to who is the one that becomes the waker? Who is the one that becomes the dreamer? Who is it that becomes the deep sleeper? Because if I say at one time I am a waker in the waking state of consciousness, enjoying the waking world. At another time I say I'm the dreamer in the dream state of consciousness, enjoying the dream world. And at another time I am a deep sleeper, enjoying nothingness. Then the question, of course, comes back as, well, who's this I that I'm talking about? And so this is what an analysis of the three states of consciousness and essentially the three personalities does, is that it points towards something which transcends the three states. So when we say it transcends it, think of it in the same way that space transcends objects. So space is the medium in which objects exist. You look at your home and you have bedroom space, living room space, office space, three different spaces. They only exist in total space. So it transcends them. And the space is not limited, constrained, or defined by those walls. It only appears to be the case from the perspective of that room. If you were to knock down the walls, you recognize you never constrained space to being in this particular shape. That was just the walls. So using that analogy, there's something which is the space in which the waker, dreamer, and deep sleeper arise, which transcends them, and which is never constrained or limited by them. And that is this sense of I am. So when you are experiencing a dream, you experience it from the first person perspective of I. And when I see a tiger, I run. When I see my dear departed grandfather, I walk to embrace him. I do these things. When I wake up out of that dream, I continue with that claim. I saw a tiger. I saw my grandfather. And of course, here in the waking state, I am now awake and telling you all about my dream. So the one who saw the grandfather, the one who saw the tiger, is not the same personality as the one who recounts it later on. They're different personalities. One is a dreamer, one is a waker. So in going from the dream state to the waking state, the dream world completely disappears, like mist before dawn. So does the dreamer. The dreamer and the dream world that they experience do not survive that transition out of the dream. So too in the waking state, you have a waker, your waking personality, and you have a waking world that you're contacting. When you go into dream or deep sleep, the waker and the world that they experience are lost. Does not survive the transition. And yet the I am that we claim here in the waking state is there. It's present in the dream state as well. So this is why we say it transcends them. In the same way that the space in your office is there next to the space of your bedroom. That space isn't actually separated out by those walls. That space exists all pervasively, all the way through. And we put some walls up and characterize the space within those walls as bedroom, office. So too, the I am is present everywhere. When the constraints of the dream state are there, we say, I am the dreamer. When the constraints of the waking state are there, I am the waker. And when the constraints of deep sleep, I am nothing. So this I am that is present everywhere and which is not constrained by the three states of consciousness is indicative of our essential nature, who we really are. I am not the waker, the dreamer, or the deep sleeper. These are different roles or personae that I adopt depending upon the state of consciousness that I'm in. Then who am I? I am the I am which transcends them. I'm not the living room space, I am total space. I'm not the bedroom space, I am total space. I'm not the bathroom space, I'm total space. At one time, total space appears as a bedroom space because of the walls that we have created around it. But in truth, you haven't done anything to the walls. And so this is the value of adopting the three perspectives of waker, dreamer, and deep sleeper, because it gives us the opportunity to project something outside it. This is the role of Vedanta, to bring us to an all-pervading sense of who and what we are that is unconstrained and unlimited. So this is why he says the fourth state is proclaimed as the real state, your original self. So this is what we were touching on last time. The other aspect we were touching on last time was this idea that we are all being pressurized to find that self, whether we realize it or not. So the analogy that he gives is that of a coiled spring. If you compress it, you feel a pressure against your hand until such time as you release it back to its original state. And when it's back at its original state, there's no pressure. A human being is constantly pressurized, we feel it, to go somewhere, to get something, to achieve, to acquire, and to enjoy. There is this constant pressure. And when we get that object that we were pursuing, what do we experience? We experience a temporary satisfaction, peace. We feel at rest. Everything is as it should be. I don't need anything else. And this is how we feel for a period of time until the pressure comes back. And so if we observe this way of functioning, then we are constantly pressurized to get to a state of being at rest, a mind which is at rest. We want stability, peace, an unchanging, unbroken sense of being at rest. So this is not possible if we are seeking that sense of rest or peace from the world. The mind is constantly changing, the world is constantly changing. If we try to gain that sense of peace or stability, when the two factors which go into it are both changing, you're never going to find it. The analogy we can think of, if you have one hand and another hand and you bring them together, if they're both moving, you have friction. The mind is always moving, its demands are changing. The world is always changing, obviously. So where these two changing factors come together, he says, how then can there be any stability, harmony in their interaction, any peace and happiness in the world? So there isn't. There is no peace and happiness in the world per se. The way to gain that peace and happiness is to find something which has an enduring stability. What is that thing which has enduring stability? Not the waking state, it goes. Not the dream state, it fluctuates. Not the deep sleep state, it comes and goes. What has that enduring stability in our experiences is that sense of I am, the self. So this is why he calls it the real state. So the word real, when we use that phrase, means it does not change. Same in past, present, and future. So what we're looking to do is to gradually gain the knowledge of the self. And where we finished off last time was the 4 methods of gaining knowledge: direct perception, inference, comparison, and tradition. So the first, direct perception, is not useful for gaining self-knowledge because you can never see or perceive the self. Inference can be useful because it's showing us, it's giving us a direction for our attention, and so too with comparison. So when we infer things and when we compare things, we get a sort of vicarious knowledge of the self. So in the same way that he gives the examples in the text, you see smoke, you infer fire. So it's a known cause-effect relationship. Or you compare the great Maratha chief Shivaji to a tiger. You know something now about Shivaji, his strength and his courage. And tradition is having faith in something, but not blind faith. This is the important point. So faith is another method of gaining knowledge, but only if it's not blind. The moment we have blind faith, we are not gaining knowledge. We are instead gaining an unjustifiable certainty, fanaticism in a sense. So any questions on any of that before we sort of launch back into where we left off last time? Okay, so let's just go to the text and pick up where we left off. So there are 4 means to gain knowledge: pratyaksha, direct perception; anumana, inference; upama, comparison; and agama, tradition. So we went through them last time, but we didn't go through the text, so let's just have a look at how he describes these. pratyaksha. One way of gaining knowledge is by perception through your sense organs. Your eyes see color and form of an object, and you know the nature of that object. Your ears hear sound, nose smells, tongue tastes, and skin feels the touch. The organs of perception are used to gain the knowledge of the world, but these senses cannot know the self, Atman, within. You cannot gain the knowledge of self by direct perception. So the senses have no reliable function in terms of gaining us self-knowledge. All that the senses can deliver us is information about the world. So the information about the world is a starting point. We often return back to the mechanism that he describes in chapter 3. Receipt, reaction, response. This is how we gain our experiences of the world. So it starts with receiving stimuli from the world, and it ends with responding back into the world. So the world is the beginning and the end of gaining experiences, if you like. But in and of itself, stimuli give us no reliable information about who we are as individuals. So it's limited in that regard. Next is inference. He says, anumana. Another method of gaining knowledge is through inference. Just as you see smoke and infer there is fire. Though you may not actually see the fire, you could employ this method to get to know the self. You learn from knowledge and experience that an extroverted, indulgent life leads one to mental agitation and sorrow. Conversely, introverted pursuit of truth brings inner peace and joy. The more introvert, objective you are, the more peaceful, joyful you become. The pleasures of the physical body may be enjoyable, but they have a limitation. They become insignificant before emotional feelings. The emotion of joy that the mind derives is subtler, superior to physical indulgence. One could give up a physical pleasure for an emotional joy. Far superior and subtler than emotional feeling is intellectual satisfaction. To gain the ecstasy of intellectual wisdom, one would readily sacrifice one's emotional joy or physical pleasure. Thus, your happiness increases as you delve deeper into your personality. Stretch this principle further to the innermost core of your personality, the self within. You infer the bliss of the self to be supreme. So this is how he's using inference to gain some knowledge of the self. We establish, first of all, a reliable cause-effect relationship. So what he's saying is that as we grow into subtler levels of our personality, the joy that we derive is of a superior quality. It's more long-lasting and it's of a finer quality in and of itself. So he says you would give up a physical pleasure for an emotional joy. So I think we gave this example last week. You've got a big bag of cherries. You can enjoy all of them yourself through the senses. It's a physical sensory pleasure. Now you'll get a certain amount of satisfaction out of that and of a certain grade or quality. If you share those same cherries, then you are giving up a physical pleasure. You're losing it. But the question is, the question is, in giving up the physical pleasure, what are you gaining? Well, you're gaining an emotional joy. There is the satisfaction that comes with connecting and sharing. And so you recognize that not only does that satisfaction last longer, but it has a finer quality to it. You can sit there and eat cherries all night until the bag's finished. So the joy that you get from one cherry, how long does it last? 10, 12 seconds, then you reach for another one. If it lasted longer than that, then you wouldn't reach. But once you've connected with someone and shared half your cherries with them while you're watching a movie, they go home, your friend goes home. How do you feel? So that feeling of connection, that emotional joy lasts longer. So too, gaining insight and wisdom. That gives you a superior sense of joy to emotions. So once we accept this through our reflection and through our experiences, then we've set up a reliable cause-effect relationship. So now we go to this idea that, well, what happens if I go to the subtlest level of my personality, the thing which pervades everywhere, that I am that we're talking about? Well, naturally, based on what we know, to identify with the subtler levels of the personality brings more joy. To identify with the subtlest level of the personality brings maximum satisfaction, maximum joy. So we've learned something about the self, that identifying with the self brings that supreme sense of stability or bliss that he was talking about. So this is how we have gained information or gained some understanding of the self. So it doesn't mean that we are necessarily experiencing that, although he touches on that as we go through. So at the moment, he's talking more about intelligence or information. But we use that information to actually get closer and closer to the self, which is the next section. Upama, a third means of gaining knowledge is comparison. An unknown object is made known by comparing it to something known to you. The Supreme Self within is not known to you. The fourth state of self-realization is unknown. One has no idea of that state until one reaches it. However, by drawing a comparison of the fourth and waking states with the waking and dream states, one could possibly envision the nature of that transcendental experience. The Shastra, scripture, declares that the entire pluralistic phenomena of the world you experience merges into the one reality upon self-realization. All the consciousness of perception, emotion, and thought retire to the one pure consciousness. This goes beyond human comprehension. How can this solid, substantial world disappear into nothingness? Okay, so he explains more about that concept in the next paragraph. But before we get there, again, let's look at what he's doing here. He's trying to convey the knowledge of the self so that we have somewhere to place our attention. The whole idea of gaining these concepts and these ideas is a way of redirecting our attention onto something that makes us more objective, that liberates us from the sense of constraint that we experience by identifying with body, mind, and intellect. So this is why the comparison is drawn. He says, look at the waking state of consciousness. Compare it to the dream state. While you're in the dream, it seems very real. The moment you leave that state of consciousness and enter a higher one, the waking state, that whole thing folds back. It's seen as what it is. The whole dream was nothing other than fibers and fibers of the waker's mind. Okay, you can't see the waking state while you're in a dream. It's impossible. You can only become the waker. So these are all the sorts of analogies and aspects of the waking and dream states of consciousness that we can talk about. So many of them have a correlation in the distinction between waking consciousness that we're experiencing now and the fourth state. So just as Shivaji is like a tiger, now we know something about Shivaji. Just as going from dream to waking is like going from waking to the fourth state. Aha, so we know something now about that fourth state. We can use that knowledge as a way of directing our attention. So in the same way, the state of self-realization, the fourth state, is utterly unknown to us. It's as unknown as the waking state is to the dreamer. So this is a really important comparison because people may feel that, oh, I had a glimpse of the fourth state last night in my meditation. So I've heard people say this. I've heard people say that in my morning meditation, I get to the pure consciousness. I slip into it and I'm there for a while. And then I come back out and I interact in the world. So this would dispel that notion that in the same way that the dreamer has no contact or connection to the waking state except to wake up, then anything we experience here in the waking state will not be turiya, will not be the fourth state of pure consciousness. It will still be within the bounds of the dream. Even though it may feel like it is the pinnacle of human experience, it's still within the realm of the terrestrial. So that helps to keep us objective to any experiences that we might have as we go along the spiritual path that seem to be peak. Have I reached it? Well, no, I'm still in the dream, as it were. So this idea helps to keep us objective. So he talks about this idea. He says, how can the solid substantial world disappear into nothingness? The means of comparison helps clear this mystery. The transformation of a waker into the self-realized person is akin to the transformation of a dreamer into the waker. The waker views the objects and beings and all his experiences in the waking world as distinct, innumerable. So does the dreamer view the dream objects and beings and all his experiences in the dream world as distinct, innumerable. The dreamer's experience of the pluralistic phenomena of the dream continues as long as the dream lasts. The moment the dreamer wakes up, becomes the waker, the entire dream world folds back into the one waker's mind. The waker instantly realizes that the one mind has diversified into the pluralistic phenomena of the dream. One ray of the mind became the dreamer, another ray, the dreamer's wife, a third, the dreamer's child. Thus, rays and rays of the mind had projected the dream sun, moon, stars, the flora and fauna, and the rest of the dream world. The dreamer's intellect can never conceive, much less accept, that the countless things, beings, and experiences are all but the one mind of the waker. Only the waker realizes that. So this is the edge that the waker has over the dreamer. Now that we are in the waking state of consciousness, we can make this comparison between dream state and waking state. And you can look back at your dream and say, you know, I thought that everything in my dream was so real. It was so meaningful, and I reacted as if it was so intrinsically real. And now here I am in the waking state. I see that whole thing was just meaningless, just an illusion, nothing. With that comparison in mind, now we can say, well, I wonder if this waking state of consciousness, which seems so real for me now I'm in it, I wonder if this too is not real, and then there is yet another state from which I will look back at the waking state and say, I treated this thing like it was so real. I was so worried about and so concerned about my petty experiences. The whole thing was, if we can adopt that perspective, then we gain some objectivity to our waking state. So this objectivity that we gain is drawn from the comparison of dream state to waking state. Just imagine, just allow for the possibility, thought experiment, that this waking as illusory and empty as the dream state that I took to be so real. It's just entertaining that thought to give a little bit of space between ourselves and our experiences. Otherwise, we are completely involved. So he continues with that same thought. He says, similarly, as long as the waking state lasts, the waker experiences countless things and beings, emotions and thoughts. The waker's intellect can never conceive, except the pluralistic phenomena of the waking world are all nothing but the one supreme reality, Brahman. Only when the waker realizes his supreme self, moves up from the waking to the fourth state of self-realization, the waker and his world merges into that one reality. Thereafter, The reality, Brahman, alone exists. The enlightened then realizes that the entire pluralistic world of the waking state is but the one reality alone. So go back to the analogy or the example of the dream. When you wake up, you realize that the entire pluralistic world of the dream was just that one mind, appearing with different names and forms. Easy. Now we can view our current, our present waking world in the same way. This is just a pure consciousness taking the shape of the different names and forms I see around me. And that there's nothing inherently real about the world in the same way that there's nothing inherently real about the dream world. Imagine that. So that gives us an opportunity to work with this thought experiment. Agama. The fourth means of attaining knowledge is through tradition. Tradition is based on time-honored preaching and practice. The ancient sages have tried to expound their ultimate experience of the self, but could not effectively communicate because of the limitations of the body, mind, and intellect to receive it. The fourth plane of God consciousness cannot be captured by the waker's perception, emotion, and thought in the waking state of consciousness, much less through the states of dream and deep sleep. Nothing from the terrestrial world can describe the transcendental being. So let's just quickly pause there. So this is the problem that the self-realized sages have. For those that have attained the fourth state of consciousness, it is still impossible for them to impart it. In fact, there's more than one phrase in these texts which say that we do not know how to impart it. Not because they lack the intellectual acuity, because it's impossible. Imagine that you are somehow able to enter the dream of one of your friends. You enter their dreamscape and all the crazy, fantastical things that it contains. And you know the whole thing is just a dream, but she's there and she's interacting as if it's real. What would you say to convey to her that this is not real, that you're not actually awake? There's nothing you can do, because from her perspective, she is awake. Of course I'm awake. You're talking to me, right? You're telling me I'm not awake, that I'm dreaming. There's nothing you can do to communicate it. And so too with the self-realized sages. Nothing they can do to communicate the self. All that can be done is to present words, words, words. And those words, when we relate to them effectively, can help us to become more objective and to ultimately reach that ourselves. But we also have to realize that we don't know what they are talking about. And so we need an element of trust or faith. So this is what he's talking about here, the inability of the sages to communicate it means that we have to cooperate. Now, one thing is to approach the text or to approach the master and say, okay, teach me, in a sense of give me the information. It's like going to a doctor and saying, okay, right now, heal me. I'm sick, heal me. There's an arrogance there. That will not work. Nothing will happen. There must be a cooperation on the part of the patient. There must be a cooperation on the part of the student. And so when the teacher gives an analogy, in fact, this is a great example because I've seen this in an interview. So the Swami is being interviewed, I think, on South African television. And he said, and he was trying to convey the idea that there are certain fundamental principles that govern human experience that are universal across time and space and culture and everything. Same for all of us. And he gave a very pedestrian, rudimentary analogy or example to say, well, for example, we all put food in the mouth and chew it to get nourishment. It's a universal thing for all of us. Just as a way of helping to convey the idea that there are some things that are true for us all. Now, no example is going to be perfect, but it should be good enough to carry the meaning. And once it's good enough to carry the meaning, then fine, it's done its job. So we have to participate. What did the interviewer say? The interviewer said, well, but what about those people who are in a coma and they're on a feeding tube through their nose? Okay, you can imagine the Swami's frustration. So it's showing that the student is not participating. I know what you're saying. Okay, you haven't phrased it perfectly because it's impossible to phrase it perfectly. Another analogy we sometimes use is that when we're in conversation with somebody, especially if that conversation is tense, let's say it's an emotional issue. A person conveys what they have, what they're what they are thinking about and what they are feeling. And we must participate to give them freedom to be a little imperfect in their expression. They might not use the right word. They might not phrase it in the right way. But generally speaking, I know what you're saying. If I were to take everything you say absolutely literally, then every 4 or 5 words I would have to stop you and we'd have to go through a thorough analysis of, but how can you say that? What do you mean by that? We don't need to do that. We participate, we cooperate with the person, and even if their language is imprecise and inelegant, if it's doing enough to convey the meaning, then that's enough. So the job of the student is to cooperate, to surrender that sense of, but what about? Okay, I know generally what you're saying. I am receiving that. So this is that feeling of surrender or of faith that we have towards these texts, towards these teachers, that what they are saying cannot be taken exactly at face value because they're trying to convey the inexpressible. They're trying to use language to say something which cannot be described in language. So we have some faith in what they are talking about. But as he touches on next, that faith must not be blind. So he continues on. He says, the sages understood the difficulty of the mortals to conceive the immortal self. Hence, they explained the waking, dream, and deep sleep states of consciousness exhaustively. They analyzed these states with chaste logic and reason and projected the possibility of the transcendental reality. Following their methodic presentation of facts and figures, one develops a faith in the reality. Not a blind faith, but one that is born of conviction. Such faith is further reinforced by unequivocal declaration of self-realized souls. Rabindranath Tagore, the Indian poet-philosopher, describes this faith as a bird that feels the light and sings while the dawn is still dark. The Vedantic tradition helps you feel the light of consciousness even as you remain in the darkness of ignorance. So the faith that he's talking about here allows us to follow along with the teacher. It allows us to walk that path with them through reasoning, through logic, through feeling, through our practices and our action. Now, we don't know what that end point is, and yet we have faith in the end point. You can take a simple example. You go on a walking trek in an area you've never been that you don't know, and you have a guide. And they've got a compass around their neck, and they've got a map and sturdy walking shoes that are well broken in, and they seem to know the area. You walk with them. You follow along behind happily. Why? Because you have faith in the destination. You have faith in the path that you're going to tread. Now, that faith is not blind. You haven't randomly picked someone and said, here, walk me around these trails. It's based on logic. It's based on evidence. In the same way, we do our own checking, our own due diligence, and when we find a tradition that seems to be talking about this thing, that it's stable, that it's tested through time, then we develop a faith that the information and the methodology is sound, even though we don't know for certain because we haven't yet reached the end point. So he says it helps you to feel the light of consciousness. Yes, there is something there. I don't know what it is. I don't know how to describe it. So I'm still in ignorance, but I will follow along the path that has been laid down because I have that faith. And so we are, again, vicariously accepting something to be the case without actually knowing it, but not blindly. Okay, so that comes to the end of the 4 methods of gaining knowledge. Any clarifications before we move on to the next section?
I had a rather dumb question, actually. You know, I mean, it's been emphasized a couple of times, you know, that the other states of consciousness have to be taken into, you know, consideration. But it seems like all the practices that you know, one would do, you know, path of, you know, devotion, you know, action and knowledge, you know, seems to be heavily heavily reliant on the waking state, in the sense that you do, you know, the actual practice that you do is still in the waking state. So, but at the same time, you know, I've seen the repetition that, you know, we cannot ignore, you know, the other states. So are the other states, you know, to really show the grades and, you know, kind of the relation, you know, in the analogies, or is there something, you know, that we actually have to dig into, you know, like in the dream state, for example, right? I mean, I understand the analogy part, right? And I think that definitely drives home a point, but how much do we delve into the actual state within that state?
So the only place that we can do our self-development or spiritual practices is in the waking state. We don't have access to a fully developed mind and intellect to be able to do practices in the dream state and, of course, deep sleep state. So the importance of analyzing or understanding the different states is to break us out of our complacency that, well, this waking world and the person I think I am, this is real. So we have that so complacently, and we're so involved in that we don't even know that we think it. We're not even aware that we take this world to be real. It's a tacit assumption. And so that's why there is this emphasis on understanding the different states of consciousness, because it gives us a new perspective on the one place that we can do sadhana, which is the waking state. As far as digging into the dream state, for example, generally speaking, the use of analysis of the dream state will only come when there is some sort of consistent or pressing thought, memory, image, etc., that continues to push its way into the dream. So one of the ways that we understand the dream state is it's a bit like an opportunity for the inner personality to get rid of some undigested thoughts, some undigested experiences. And there is a if you look at some of the brain studies, so by analogy, while we are in deep sleep, some of these neural connections get trimmed, unnecessary ones. It's good. It's like pruning, so that the best use of our resources in the brain, rather than having a whole host of dangling neural connections that aren't useful at all. They can trim them off. So this is a good analogy. In the same way, we have a whole lot of emotional connections to things that we experience during our waking state, which are really not useful. The dream state offers an opportunity to just work those undigested experiences out of the personality. So by and large, we don't need to worry about what the content of the dream is. For 90% of our dreams, or 99% of our dreams, no necessity to dig into them. But if you find that there is a powerful recurring image or experience or memory or feeling or whatever it happens to be, then that is worth analyzing. But again, it's done from the perspective of the waker, and it's done into the waker, if you like. So the Swami often uses this example. Let's say you are a high-powered businessman, and you keep having all of these dreams of, you know, I'm at the top of the Himalayas sitting at the foot of a master, and the next night I have another dream where I'm living in a hut in the jungle, and the next night I'm at a Vedanta Academy, or I'm ensconced in my own room. I keep having these powerful dreams where I'm isolated, alone, living a life of renunciation and, you know, engaging in spiritual practice. So he says, well, that would indicate that there is an unfulfilled desire in the personality, and so you need to look at addressing it. So you would analyze not the dream, you analyze the waker, but using material from the dream. Mm-hmm. Another very simple example, if a person is single and he keeps having dreams of being with a person and keeps having dreams of family over every night, okay, it indicates that he has this need in the personality for marriage and family. So you're analyzing, again, the dreamer, you're analyzing the waker using material from the dream. But we need to choose that material wisely. It's not every dream that we have. We need to sort of try and analyze our way into some deeper understanding of ourselves. Mm. Any other queries? Okay. So the next section is assurance of Vedanta. So having spoken about the fourth state of consciousness, he's saying that what we are seeking is within our reach. So whether we know it or not, we are seeking self-realization. If we accept that self-realization is that state of unbroken stability, satisfaction, harmony. That's what we are looking for. We seek it through the world. We experience physical objects and gain a temporary satisfaction. And when that satisfaction decays away, we run after it again and again and again. So we can see just by observing our own experiences that we always want satisfaction, and we want top grade, A grade satisfaction, and we want it to stay. That is described as, well, that's the location, if you like, of that is within ourself. So whether we're doing it consciously or unconsciously, that the assurance of Vedanta is that that state of stability and self-realization is possible for everybody. So he now talks about the stages with which we gain that knowledge, so that every human being goes through the different stages of gaining satisfaction. And he gives a really good analogy in the text. So let's actually just go straight to the text and have a look. Oh, I think we're already on the text. He says, Vedanta assures the self is within the reach of every human being, that you can gain the fourth state of absolute peace and bliss, attain it by merging with the self. That is your mission in life. If you do not achieve it, your life is spent in vain. You suffer the greatest loss. None seems to realize this, nor even aware of the purpose of human existence. The trend everywhere is to crave for material possession and sensual enjoyment. People are enchanted by the attractions of the external world and live a superficial life, with no concern for the underlying reality within them. They are lost in the waking, dream, and deep sleep states of consciousness and totally involved in the temporal existence of these states, ignorant and indifferent towards their absolute state of the divine self. But those who seek the self within enjoy peace and bliss progressively. Pursuing the spiritual path, they finally attain the absolute bliss of enlightenment. So you may be familiar with the phrase, the unexamined life is not worth living. So there are different ways that we can sort of interpret that phrase or that idea. This is a very powerful way of thinking about it, that there is a mission in human life. And it's very interesting. The text, the author, is telling us what our mission is. So remember that this is not someone imposing their ideology on us. This is the ideas that have been digested for thousands of years by different teachers and different students. And they're arriving at a conclusion that is true for all of us. So it's not the imposition of an ideology, it's the conclusion of observation and thinking. It's a scientific method. So he says your mission in life is to merge with yourself. So we set that as the mission when we say that we want permanent, unbroken satisfaction. There are those who have recognized that that permanent unsatisfaction is within one's own self. So if you say you want permanent, unbroken satisfaction, then it becomes your mission to find it within yourself. And he's using a couple of ideas here that come directly from the Upanishads. If you do not achieve it, your life is spent in vain. The greatest loss, mahati vinashtihi, is one of the phrases in Sanskrit. The greatest of great losses. And so the lack of understanding of this idea means that we don't seek something deeper in life. We are stuck with material possession and sensual enjoyment. He calls it, this superficial way of functioning in the world. Yes, you can gain a certain amount of satisfaction through materiality and sensuality, but it's very superficial joy. There is much, much deeper, subtler joy available to us if we allow our pursuit of self-knowledge to strike deep into the personality. If we take the attention inward, 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 always searching to find who we are, then we go deeper into ourselves. If we just satisfy the demands that lie on the surface of the personality, that's where we stay. As you think, so you become. So we are asserting our personalities with every choice, every action that we make. If I dress a certain way to get attention, then I'm operating at the physical level. If I act a certain way so that people like me, then I'm operating at the emotional level. If I conduct myself in life to gain more insight and understanding, then I'm operating at the intellectual level. So my choices show me where I am identified. And as we were touching on earlier, as we go to the subtler levels, we gain a deeper sense of satisfaction. So this is what he's talking about now. So he talks about these different stages of gaining knowledge, and as a result, these different levels of satisfaction that we enjoy in life. And just a word on this idea of satisfaction. The problem here is that we come with preconceived ideas of what joy, happiness, satisfaction looks like. What is Vedanta saying we get? Well, it's saying we get more satisfaction as we grow. Okay, so that means that there'll be no more sadness in my life. Great. Don't like sadness. No, it doesn't mean that. Your body goes through health, ill health. Your mind goes through joy and sorrow. So achieving a more stable sense of satisfaction doesn't mean that you don't have sadness anymore. It doesn't mean that you don't go through joy, sorrow, grief, loss, profit, etc. The body, mind, and intellect will still go through their fluctuations. What this is saying is that that's not a definition of happiness. That's the definition of happiness for someone who is, frankly, ignorant and extroverted. I know how to be happy, satisfy my desire, avoid things I don't like, etc. So happiness now, we need to expand out our definition of what happiness means. That we can still go through the joy of celebration and the sorrow of loss and not have our happiness affected. So what's the analogy we always use when we're talking about this idea?
Watching a movie.
Watching a movie. You watch Romeo and Juliet, you watch Titanic, and your mind goes through joy during one scene, gets plunged into sadness and loss and grief and heartbreak in another scene. But your enjoyment, your happiness, your satisfaction isn't changed by that. You go there to be heartbroken. You go there to celebrate, etc. You go there for the bittersweet ending. So too, it's not that we define happiness as a particular emotional profile or a particular physical state. It's defined by our relationship with those. So this is another really important aspect of starting to redefine what happiness is and not expecting ourselves to be absent certain emotions or perceptions or ideas. It's being okay with what is. So he says then there are these 4 stages in which we gain happiness. So don't worry too much about the Sanskrit, but the Salokyam is the first one. This basically means that we are generally entering the realm of the self. So what does that mean? When we talk about Vedanta as an applied philosophy, we talk about it as a subjective science. In the same way that if I'm a biologist, I place my attention on biological systems. I observe them, I make inferences, I draw conclusions, I have theses, and I test them out and I come to conclusions, and etc., etc. Same thing. I turn my attention inwards towards the subject. It's the same method of inquiry, it's the same scientific method, but instead of the field of inquiry being out there, the field of inquiry is now inwards towards the self. So this is the first step onto the spiritual path, is turning introvert. And the moment we turn introvert and start to seek something from within ourselves now, to that extent, we gain an immediate sense of relief or release from the agitations of the external world. The question is why? Why is this the case? That if I turn introvert, and we may even need to define what we mean by that, but for the moment, if I turn introvert, I will feel an immediate sense of relief. Why?
Because we're no longer saddled with the pressures of the external world.
So where have those pressures come from?
Desires.
Exactly. So the question that we can ask is, well, okay, if I feel like I need relief from the external world at all. The question is relief from what? And it's that feeling of mental agitation. And we can characterize that in a range of different ways. But generally speaking, mental agitation. That's what I want relief from. But where does the mental agitation come from? I'm expecting the world to be one way, and it turns out to be another. I have a desire for something, and that desire is not met by the world. I'm attached to something, and that thing leaves me. So the whole cause of that mental agitation is that my mind is going out into the world with desires, attachments, and expectations. If I withdraw that thought current and now turn it inwards, then to the extent that I'm able to do that, the cause of agitation is diminished, and so I feel a relief. And you can take any simple example. Let's say you have a roommate, a housemate, and that person is a noisy eater. You may know someone along these lines, whenever they eat. You've asked them politely a couple of times, can you make a little bit quieter? But basically that's their nature. So if every day I get up and I sit with them at breakfast and they're making noise while they're eating, every day, if my preferences are functioning, I hope that person is quiet today. Every day I'm going to be disappointed. Now, what happens if I make an accurate assessment of my environment? I say that's what the person is like, and I accept them. The moment I accept that behavior, it now no longer has the ability to cause me agitation. The world hasn't changed. The person is still a noisy eater. But what I have done is withdraw my expectation, and as a consequence, I don't feel disturbed. That's the idea of turning introvert, withdrawing the attention, that pursuit, that demand that the world be a certain way. And this is beautifully characterized actually in the first poem, Select English Poems book, is The Turkey and the Ant. And that poem is talking exactly about this, turning the attention introvert. It's the first poem in the book. It's the first lesson that we should be learning on our spiritual journey. Turn the attention inwards. So that brings us an initial feeling of peace. As we continue to practice, what's happening is that we're sort of developing an establishment or a momentum in our spiritual practice. So the word that he uses in chapter 5 of Gita, you could say here, is yogi. He's talking about someone who is consistently attuned to self-development. They're trying to improve their personality, to purify it of the gross, self-centered preferences, expectations, desires and demands and attachments. So as we gain momentum in our spiritual practice, as we gain a establishment in it, then there is another level of stability that we get. Again, this is in chapter 6, I think it's verse 19 of the Gita. As a lamp in a windless place does not flicker. So you take a lamp in a windless place and that flame remains undisturbed. Allow the breeze to flow and the flame flickers, its light is lost. So he says that the spiritual practices act like a barrier. They act like a shade protecting the flame. So as we are consistent in our spiritual practice, our morning study, our service to the community, our charitable or volunteering actions, our gratitude, our introspection, etc., then we are putting shades around the mind so that we are not disturbed by the changing world. So we gain an increased stability beyond just the immediate sense of relief at having turned the attention inwards. As that consistent practice develops, he says we get into sarupyam. So this is not just a consistency in our spiritual practice, but the vision of the end of this process starts to come into focus now. So rather than just being focused on, say, improving the personality, eradicating some gross ego-centered demands, now the individual is really only focused on one thing, and that is to merge with that self. So when we consistently attune ourselves, I should say, when we consistently attune to that self, that's all we are seeking now. I just need to know, to want who and what am I at the core of all of this. So this is the sannyasi. The yogi is one who still has worldly demands and desires, and they're looking to improve themselves to purify the personality of their egocentric nature. The sannyasi is now no longer really having to deal with any kind of worldly desires. They have shed those for the most part. The only interest that that person has now is getting back to the self. So they're less interested in purifying the personality. It's basically fine, but I've got to get back to the self. And so again, you have attuned to a higher level. You are more consistently attuning to something that is more subtle. As a consequence, of course, we experience greater mental stability. And the final stage is sayujyam. That's when we become the self. And the phrase that he uses there in chapter 5 is the jnani, the one who has knowledge. And so this is the process of the dreamer becoming the waker in the analogy. It's the process of the waker, the individual, becoming the Atman, the Brahman, the pure consciousness. So these are the 4 stages of our spiritual development. You could say there is a 5th stage when the person has no spiritual aspirations or intentions at all. So that stage would be there, but it's not part of the spiritual path. The first part of the spiritual path is turning introvert. Even if a person is associated with these ideas, a person may be brought up where their siblings and their parents are all talking about Bhagavad-Gita, Vedanta philosophy, and the person studies it. That doesn't mean the person has turned onto the spiritual path. It simply means they're studying an external body of knowledge. It's by turning introvert that we initiate that path. So the effect is that we get greater and greater peace. So let's have a look at how he describes. Any questions on that before we get back into the text and see how he describes them? So he says, relating to the proximity of the goal a seeker pursues, he experiences 4 progressive stages of happiness. Salokyam, inhabiting the same location as the object of pursuit. Samipyam, getting nearer, approaching the object. Sarupyam, seeing the form of the object. And sayujyam, merging with the object of pursuit. So this is generally applicable for anything that we pursue, whether it's terrestrial in the world or spiritual, the self. So he gives an illustration. He says, a common experience in life illustrates this progressive joy. A couple in Pune awaits the arrival of their son after long years of study in a foreign country. They hear that his plane has landed in Mumbai, more than 100 kilometers away. Yet the news of his arrival in the country, in the same location as theirs, gives them the first taste of joy. That is Salokyam. An hour later, they hear that he is driving down in a car to Pune. The fact that he is coming nearer, approaching them, provides greater joy, Samipyam. The car reaches their home. They see him from the balcony. The sight of their son excites them furthermore, Sarupyam. Then they rush down for the final embrace, the culmination of their joy, Sayujyam. So it's a very simple analogy, one that we have all probably experienced. When you imagine, when you know that that person you're waiting for, they've been away for a year, 6 months, whatever, they've landed in the same country. or the same state. The moment you get that text message, I've just touched down, you get that thrill. There's a satisfaction, there's a joy of anticipation. And then when you hear, yeah, my Uber is 20 minutes away, further anticipatory joy. And then you see the person getting out of the car and bliss. There he is, there she is. And then the culmination of it is when you finally embrace the person. So from the moment you heard, I've landed on the tarmac, you know that that whole thing is going to culminate in that final embrace. So too, we have that faith that the moment I turn introvert and start seeking an object other than the world, it's going to culminate in a final and complete realization of that self. Okay. So we won't go into the transfer of that idea into spiritual practice. We'll start with that next week. Any questions before we finish off? Okay, thanks guys. We are back again tomorrow evening for chapter 19. So I will see some of you then.
Thank you.